The woman's breath comes in ragged gasps as her bare feet sink into mud still warm from burning thatch. The woman's breath comes in ragged gasps as her bare feet sink into mud still warm from burning thatch. Behind her, torchlight fractures through the morning mist, illuminating silhouettes that move with terrible purpose. They are not running. They do not need to. The year is AD 845, somewhere along the banks of the Seine, and she already knows what they want is not the silver hidden beneath her floor, not the livestock penned behind her home. What they want is her. I'd love to know where you're watching from. It amazes me how a story this dark, buried this deep in time, still finds us across every border and language. The monks who survived that day would later write with trembling hands about Ragnar Lothbrok's fleet, 120 ships descending on Paris like a plague of black sails. They documented the ransom, the slaughter, the smoke that blotted out the sun. But in the margins of those parchments, tucked between prayers and dates, appears a detail the scribes could barely bring themselves to record. The women, hundreds of them dragged toward the riverbank in chains, screaming not for mercy but for death, because they already understood what mercy meant to a Viking warband. And in one chronicle, almost as an afterthought, a single line that cuts deeper than any blade. Some were never returned. Stand in that moment, not as an observer, but as someone who understands what that means. Ransom could buy back a husband, a brother, even a besieged city. But nothing, no weight of silver, no threat of retaliation, would bring back you, because you were never truly taken for ransom. You were currency of a different kind, a tool of war that required no forge, no sharpening, just terror, humiliation, and time. The story of Viking expansion across Europe is told in textbooks as a saga of exploration, of daring seafarers and master traders who shaped the medieval world. But beneath that narrative lies another story, one written in silence and scars. A story of systematic brutality directed not at armies or fortresses, but at the wives, daughters, and sisters of their enemies. Forced concubinage wasn't a side effect of Viking conquest, it was a weapon. Rape wasn't collateral damage, it was strategy. And the trafficking of women across seas and continents wasn't opportunistic, it was economy. How do we know? Because the sources survive, scattered across languages and centuries like shrapnel. Dudo of Saint-Quentin in the 10th century writes of wickedness committed upon the matrons of Rouen, with a prose so shaken it abandons its usual formality. The annals of Fulda record that after a raid in 881, women were dragged to ships like cattle, not metaphor, but eyewitness precision. Even the Icelandic sagas, composed generations later by descendants who took pride in their Viking ancestry, speak bluntly of abductions, of women seized to prove a chieftain's might, of marriages that were anything but voluntary. Some modern scholars point to exaggeration, to monks painting their pagan enemies in biblical archetypes of evil. But then archaeology speaks. DNA studies of skeletal remains in Dublin, in York, in the Orkney Islands reveal sudden influxes of Scandinavian genetic markers, but not the kind that suggest mutual settlement. The pattern is chilling. Norse Y chromosomes paired with Irish, Anglo-Saxon, and Slavic mitochondrial DNA, transmitted only through mothers. Translation: Viking men arrived and took local women, and many of those women bear skeletal evidence of trauma, healed fractures, signs of nutritional stress, patterns consistent with enslavement, thraldom. The Norse word sits heavy on the tongue even now. It was not an accidental practice, it was infrastructure. Enslaved women cooked, cleaned, tended livestock, wove the textiles that became trade goods, and they produced children, new generations of workers born into bondage. The 13th century Laxdæla saga tells the story of Melkorka, described as an Irish princess captured young. But read between the lines and the truth emerges. She was breeding stock. When her captor demands she speak, she pretends to be mute, refusing even language to the man who owns her body. That silence, stubborn, defiant, heartbreaking, is one of the few acts of resistance the sagas accidentally preserve. Return now to the riverbank. The captured women have been loaded below deck, heavy iron biting into wrists. The rowing begins. From their perspective, there is only suffocating darkness, the stink of unwashed bodies pressed together, and the certainty of being sailed off the edge of the known world. The Frankish chronicler Prudentius describes how Viking ships glided like dragons across the water. But he does not describe what happens in the darkness below those dragon heads. Chronicle language reduces it to euphemism. Dishonored. Used shamefully. Taken by force. We are left to reconstruct. Picture the silence after screams. The chieftain emerging from a tent at dawn, wiping his hands. A young wife of Rouen sitting on straw, dress torn, face blank with shock. She is alive. But the weapon used against her is more insidious than any sword. It is memory. You are now impure in the eyes of your own people. Even if you escape, even if you somehow find your way home, your body condemns you. This was not incidental cruelty. This was calculated. By harming women, the Norsemen wounded entire communities' sense of honor, of order, of safety. Consider Ireland. The Annals of Ulster, entry for 821, describes raiders at Dublin. They took women by violence, carried them to ships, grieving the land. That phrase, grieving the land, contains multitudes. It wasn't just families mourning lost daughters. It was cultural trauma, the rupture of social fabric. And it wasn't isolated. York, Rouen, Hamburg, Kiev, across every region Vikings touched, the pattern repeats. Women disappear from records. Population demographics collapse. And in Norse trading hubs, archaeologists find shackles sized specifically for women and children. At Birka in Sweden, iron collars were unearthed with locks so precisely crafted they still function today. Museum curators demonstrate them with grim faces, and every time that lock clicks shut, audiences flinch. Because that sound, that heavy, final click, was the last sound of freedom thousands of women ever heard. Some women were forced into marriages with their captors. The sagas recall these unions almost fondly, from the male perspective. A jarl takes a captive wife. She bears him sons. Everyone lives happily. But strip away the narrative gloss, and you see it clearly. Marriage was just a cage with different bars. To an enslaved woman, there was no meaningful difference between being a concubine and being a wife. Both meant you belonged to someone. Both meant your body was not your own. Why this fixation on enemy wives? Silver could be stolen anywhere. Livestock could be driven from any farm. But women represented something deeper, cultural continuity. Take them, brutalize them, impregnate them, and you erase your enemy's lineage. Wars could be won not just with axes but with wombs. Some Viking leaders codified this strategy. Heimskringla, the saga of Norwegian kings, casually mentions Harald Fairhair seizing women from rival clans to strengthen his bloodline. To Norse ears, this was proof of divine favor. To their enemies, it was horror sanctified. The strangest testimonies come from graves. Burials of Viking warriors in England sometimes include women's jewelry that doesn't match Norse styles. Brooches, pins, pendants clearly foreign. Likely they were torn from the bodies of enslaved women who once wore them. Imagine the silence of those artifacts underground. A bracelet once clasped around a wrist in Mercia, now buried in a warrior's grave in Jorvik as proof of conquest. Jewelry turned into epitaph. And then comes the Battle of Malden in 991. The Vikings win, slaughter the Anglo-Saxon defenders, and demand tribute. But an Old English poem survives, mourning not just the death of Ealdorman Beartnoth, but something worse. In a chilling line, the poet writes that wives would pass into the hands of enemies, and then the poem stops. The scribe cannot continue. The ink breaks into a blotch on the parchment, as if the horror itself resisted being written. Because every reader knew what the hands of enemies meant. It was not ransom. It was not honorable captivity. It was the fate whispered about in every village when mothers warned daughters never to walk alone after dark. For a woman seized at Malden, life collapsed into a sequence of transfers. Dragged to the Thames, loaded onto a ship, sailed to Dublin, sold in a market, perhaps marched east again into the Baltic. By then her name would be forgotten. She was no longer Elfgifu or Edgith. She was just Thrall. And sometimes that thrall carried a scar more invisible than shackles, a child born of rape. Those children grew not in their mother's culture, but in their captors. The sagas celebrate them as strong, well-born through conquest. But between those words lies the silent ache of women who never consented, whose bodies became battlegrounds where victory was inscribed generation after generation. Iceland's settlement records catalog this with disturbing casualness. Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, lists which families arrived with which wives and concubines. Some women are identified only as a woman from Ireland, nameless, yet foundational to entire dynasties. Iceland's genetic history confirms it. A heavy proportion of Scandinavian paternal DNA paired with Irish and Scottish maternal DNA. In simpler terms, Norse men took foreign women en masse. And those women, working farmsteads in a land nothing like home, humming lullabies in languages their children would forget, were the hidden foundation of Norse Iceland. Archaeology sharpens the picture further. In York, female skeletons from the 10th century show DNA markers consistent with Irish origin. Many died young, late teens, early 20s. Several show signs of brutal labor, ridges in bone where muscle strained constantly, spinal arthritis in women not yet 20. These were not honored ladies married into greatness. These were enslaved women worked to exhaustion while nursing children not their own. The traffic stretched beyond Europe. Islamic geographers writing in Baghdad note that the Rus, Eastern Vikings, brought slaves in great caravans down the Volga and Dnieper. These accounts specify, mostly women. Why? Because in Constantinople, in Cordoba, in the great markets of the Abbasid Caliphate, female slaves fetched the highest prices. Arab chroniclers describe how Scandinavian traders fattened their captives, dressed them in fine clothes they didn't own, displayed them on platforms for inspection. Buyers would touch a woman's face, check her teeth like livestock. By then, her life before capture had become a dream she no longer trusted was real. Consider the geographer Ibn Rusta in the late 9th century, describing the Rus with clinical precision. They treat their captives as one would treat cattle, not hyperbole, fact. And buried in Greek papyri from Ravenna are transaction records. 3 maidens purchased, 1 wife and 2 daughters transferred. Women reduced to ledger entries, their names erased, their existence monetized. Yet somehow, impossibly, resistance survived. The sagas occasionally slip, revealing cracks in the narrative. A woman who teaches her children Irish words despite punishment. A thrall who escapes into a forest and is never found. Oral traditions in Slavic regions speak of women who leapt into rivers rather than board ships, choosing death over captivity. These stories are dismissed as folklore, but oral memory often preserves trauma more faithfully than official records. The grotesque becomes legend, the legend becomes warning. And what of Constantinople? The Varangian Guard, elite Norse mercenaries serving Byzantine emperors, brought their own slaves with them, foreign women compelled to serve even in the marble halls of the imperial capital. Imagine walking those corridors, mosaics glittering overhead and behind every towering Norse warrior, a silent woman whose gaze never lifts from the floor. By the year 1000, some historians estimate that 1/10 or more of Scandinavia's population were thralls. Walk through a Norse village and every 10th face belonged to someone who was not free. And because women were disproportionately enslaved, it meant entire households functioned on the subjugated labor of conquered wives and daughters. This was the secret engine of Viking prosperity, not just daring raids or clever trade routes, but the systematic exploitation of enslaved women who wove the cloth, raised the children, and tended the farms that made expansion possible. Yet the sagas barely mention them. Heroes are glorified, kings are immortalized, but the women who made it all possible vanish into footnotes, taken, freed after many years, married into the household, as if those passive verbs could erase what was endured. By the late 11th century, Christianity spread into Scandinavia, bringing new moral codes. Priests condemned sexual slavery. Slowly, painfully, the machinery of thraldom cracked. But not before 3 centuries of suffering had been woven into the soil, into the genes, into the lullabies hummed by women whose names no one bothered to record. Picture one final image. A farmhouse in Iceland, AD 950. The fire crackles. Children sleep. A woman stirs the hearth, humming a melody strange to Icelandic ears. Perhaps Irish, perhaps Slavic. No one writes her name. She will die in that farmhouse. Her grandchildren will claim to be pure Norse, forgetting entirely the captive who kept them alive. But the earth remembers. Centuries later, archaeologists will dig and find her bones. They will reconstruct her life through isotope analysis, through DNA, through the ridges in her vertebrae that tell of endless labor. And finally, her voice will be heard. The real hidden history of the Vikings is not glittering silver or daring seafarers. It is the unspeakable sorrow of conquered wives. Stories not written in ink, but in silence, scars, and songs. We, standing centuries later, are left to listen hard, to hear the truths the sagas refused and to remember the women they tried so desperately to erase. Listen across the centuries. You can almost still hear it, the echo of bare feet on wet earth, the rasp of lungs burning with panic, the sob when chains close shut. One woman, thousands of women. Their footsteps trampled into history by men who thought themselves gods. But history is stubborn. The sagas may forget, the chroniclers may flinch, but the bones, the blood, the whispers, they remember, and so must we.